That's what like really scares me right now is that some of these early tools people are so comfortable just porting over their entire system into because we're so desperate for help. But I think what some people forget is that once you like port over all that information into a certain tool, like that tool then defines your organization.
Hello, friends. It's your host, Jess, and welcome to At the Edges of Coordination. Coordination around shared principles is the unifying through line for DAOs and community-owned networks. In Web3, we refer to shared decision-making as governance, which suggests something elaborate and overly orchestrated. But does it have to be? Join us in our new mini-series where we chat with 4 of the top coordination thinkers and practitioners in the DAO ecosystem. Julz, welcome to Club.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
I love the fact that we get to chat here today because it has been too long. And I think most of the crypto events that I've been to have been punctuated with you being there and being big energy and us having a really short, intense, fun conversation and then not seeing each other for a very long time.
I know. That's usually how it goes for us somehow.
It's us. It's our relationship. And I'm here
Yeah.
for it.
I feel like it's because like we know the love is so deep that it's like we don't need to really like emphasize it. We just know that it is.
Oh, I feel that. So I have so many questions. I think this topic of, we're sort of diving into this idea of governance and decision making and like how do DAOs actually work? And, this is obviously a thread that you've just been pulling on and building on and sort of in the trenches on for, well, months and months and months at this point. And I'm also sort of feeling like I'm a bit on the outside of seeing like really what is going on in your world. So my hope is through this conversation, we can both sort of expose some of those insights and beliefs that are sort of underpinning what you're building and maybe get into a bit of the details of what that is as well. And then I'm sure we'll go on some tangents that hopefully will be enlightening at the same time. But before we kind of get into my long list of questions here, just love for you to introduce yourself and what you're working on.
Yes. So I am Julz. I'm co-founder and chief pod officer, as named by Dan Wu on my team, of Orca Protocol. Orca is basically building an organizational graph and permissions manager. Our most favorite primitive that I talk all about is pods, which is basically sort of the smallest unit of an organization, is these small functional working groups or teams. In Orca, pods are sort of the nodes of this permissions graph, and Orca, the protocol, helps manage the edges and how all these nodes are interconnected in our organizations and our DAO networks, essentially.
So I think you've done such a great job at like owning this word pods. I mean, I think the company that's even building this is Sonar related. Like you just have this embedded in, and I think that was an insight that you had very, very early before even this latest wave of like excitement around DAO. So I'm curious, what were some of the insights that you had early on that kind of informed this really bold direction?
Yeah. Well, you were part of that early direction too. Like, I feel like we both kind of emerged at a similar time back in the day when social tokens, back in the day, aka like 2 years ago, when like social tokens were really popular. That's kind of both when we emerged. And like, obviously the social tokens thing kind of like evolved into DAOs and we had this whole process. But the original inspiration for pods and how we sort of landed on this was I was previously working just on a sort of consumer social startup and became extremely frustrated with Web 2 and everything it had to offer. Mostly that it's the same game that is being played in Web 2, which is just a game of the masses, like more people, more subscribers, more followers, just like more and more people without introducing like the right rails for value creation and sustainable growth over time. And what I became really frustrated with is that as these things got larger, whether it be like internet communities or companies, your yoga class, your group of friends, whatever it is, it has like diminishing returns on the effective capability of like coordination, communication, collaboration, all of those things. And you actually start to like lose that value a lot of the time as these things get too big. So that was sort of the early birth of pods, was like literally no matter the context, like people work best in small working groups. And that is the smallest unit of an organization, of a community, of a network, whatever it is when you have these massive networks of people, essentially it's just clusters of little pods and clusters of small working groups that exist. So that was sort of like the early inspiration for pods. which obviously has massive ripple effects into the DAO space and sort of where we both evolved into.
It's interesting where you think about some of the earlier DAO projects, like almost like the launch was this distribution of tokens to a large number of people. And then like the next step was like, okay, we'll go figure it out. Right. And
Yeah.
that lack of structure, I think, has been almost like an evolving understanding where like, very quickly you could say, okay, well, that's probably not going to work out great. Like you just can't just purely introduce an incentive layer and expect things to work
Yeah.
out. There's probably these games or structures that need to be introduced there. I'm continuously sort of surprised by how many more layers there are of understanding what that actually means and just how it can sort of sneak up on you or the challenges can sneak up on you, even if you think that you have put structures into place. So I think it's to the point where we've actually seen the pendulum swing back the other way quite a bit, and where most DAOs are actually really bringing in a lot more structure, and that structure in some ways can feel very un-DAO-like, but I don't think it's fair to say it's un-DAO-like necessarily, but I think it can feel that way, and it's because all of a sudden you start to see things like OKRs and objectives, and you start to see like, okay, well, who do I need to go to for what? And even when you see like, projects like Nouns DAO solving that in a different way, where they're saying, well, actually the work needs to get done by small teams. So let's just take care of this funding layer and like trust that centralized or smaller groups are going to go be able to go figure it out. So I think this is just like the place where we have truly the most work to do. And one of the ways that I think it shows up is in this idea of leadership. And I'm curious, in your mind, or how should we be thinking about leadership in these organizations? And I'm going to jump into pods and that sort of stuff. But to me, this is like a really big question that if we're talking about governance and decision making, leadership is traditionally how we make some of those big, messy, challenging decisions. And yet many still think that DAO should be leaderless.
Well, one, to sort of echo this framework that you're sort of calling on of how we're seeing like people asking for OKRs and like objectives and more structure while also still having a ton of appreciation for these new mechanisms, like, for example, Nouns funding mechanism. And this is actually a framework that, like, sort of a mental framework we just recently created at Orca, is the idea of trustware versus socialware. And the idea here is that socialware is an assurance mechanism that depends on human coordination and as a result has a very high social cost. So in the context of organizations, that's social processes and policies and the fact like OKRs, objectives, these are all just social processes that we're implementing. Trustware is an assurance mechanism that relies on technology and as a result has much lower social costs. In the case of, in our context, trustware is tech mechanisms that are built on a blockchain. So in the case of an organization, that looks like a Nouns funding stream mechanism, that looks like tokens, that looks like token-weighted governance. All of these things are sort of trustware, where we're relying and sort of offboarding the trust to these technical mechanisms. We use this in the context of pods, as like pods is trustware, and that you are able to group your stakeholders together and use this trust layer of Ethereum, the blockchain, to better scale your organization and not rely so heavily on bureaucracy and OKRs and objectives and all this stuff. And I think we're at a really interesting place right now with the state of DAOs and organizations where basically the demise of like the traditional form and centralized organization is that they've over-indexed on socialware. They've over-indexed on bureaucracy and, Jess has a manager and then Jess's manager has a manager. And this is all just reinforced by our social policies and information silos and blah, 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 blah. But in the case of DAOs today, I think what we've seen is people over-indexing on trustware is that they're solely relying on these mechanisms and not correctly introducing the right like social rails for these organizations to succeed properly. And so I think that's sort of where we're at right now and where we've seen a lot of this friction around governance and, this isn't working. Why are we not efficient? Why are we spending too much? All these things. It's like we never actually really put in the guardrails for us to like actually work collectively as a group of people. We sort of just introduced these mechanisms and then assumed it would sort of all fall into place. That's why we created this sort of mental framework is that you really need to make sure you're creating a bridge between your socialware and your trustware. I believe that trustware is the key thing that will take organizations to the next level and allow us to scale more effectively than we've otherwise had the opportunity to. And these pieces of socialware are still just as important in this new wave of organization. So that was my one rant on socialware, trustware. But to answer your original question around leadership, I think that's really just like a core socialware primitive is the idea of vision, someone directing a group of people, someone creating these mechanisms to move people in the right direction. There's nothing that is on chain that is saying Jess's leadership in Seed Club is absolutely required for, X event to happen. But it's a really, really essential piece of the organization for it to prosper correctly, which doesn't mean that you're not decentralized or you're not creating these polycentric governance systems. It just means that you're introducing this plethora of socialware primitives.
I love that framing. You've sort of given me language to help better describe some of the thinking I've been doing on this topic recently. The way that I've sort of been awkwardly describing it is like, we have not spent the time to develop the games or the mechanisms or interactions to allow increasingly large numbers of people to actually participate in these things. And so what you end up is a retrenchment around some sort of smaller subset of people that have the time and energy and information. And then you have a larger subset of people who are sort of unclear on where to go, are eager, want to be supportive, but there's just so much information asymmetry that they're not going to be effective in that space. And so my guess is that what we're going to see through this next wave is a lot of people, a lot of projects really trying to build in those much more clear structures for participation. And I think that's kind of where I come up with the term games, because it is like, I think for a large, especially for that broader group of human beings, you want to be able to come and do something that feels positive and impactful, and it is maybe not easy to do, but is at least very clear of like what the rules are, what the bounds are, what are we actually trying to go achieve. And so if you think about that as far as like, I guess you have your trustware and you have your socialware, those are right now very far apart in many ways, and that you have your trustware is very unopinionated and just token holders and voting. And then your socialware right now is still very, often very small teams. Like we had Brian on a few weeks ago and talking about like, why can we scale corporations to thousands of people, but we can't scale DAOs to more than, say, 50 people who are affected, or whatever that number is? And I think that we're sort of seeing that big gap. So I see a number of projects that have had this sort of insight and are doing that independently, or saying like, for our specific outcomes we're trying to drive, and this is what we're doing at Seed Club, these are the pathways that we're going to create to really start to unlock those pieces. And then a big part of what, say, a stewards team or core group of operators are going to really do in an ongoing way is continue to build and solidify and evolve and create and remove those different game pieces, or playing those game boards, I guess, that are ultimately driving towards these bigger things. So when I hear you share that, what it starts to sound like is like what pods are and what Orca is really starting to create a bunch of tools that can fit into that middle gap.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where we've been really successful with Orca and pods is it's a very like human-centered approach. Like everyone can understand the mechanism of a pod. It's just a group of people. And that is a more accessible approach to governance than like any of these other mechanisms I've seen. Like quadratic voting, like everyone's been talking about that for like 4 years to implement that as like a new DAO voting policy, but like no one successfully implemented it because it's not like a human understand or human readable mechanism that we can easily apply. And that's where I think the biggest gap is. And I think it also comes to the point too of like what comes first, the socialware or the trustware. And I think like that's kind of where pods are rooted in, is like there's already this language in socialware of like small functional teams. We're just enabling that in a trustware format for you to better scale your organization and scale that trust more effectively.
Yeah, we were joking earlier about the wonderful post that Brian Armstrong at Coinbase shared recently about how they're trying to deal with a very similar challenge, right? Like they're like, how do we go and how do we we've grown too much, and how do you grow? And what difficult thing to do with managing so many different demands and or the level of demand. And the innovation was pods. And of course, I give you a shout out for helping him come to that realization, though, is I'm sure very unrelated in many ways.
Yes, Brian and I actually worked very closely on that one.
Disclaimer, that is a joke, because apparently people didn't take your tweet in that way. Exactly.
No, they did not.
There's a great tweet, I think, I can't remember who actually sent it. It was sort of saying like building DAO tools is like trying to find product market fit by building for people who are trying to find product market fit. It's sort of like this really complex thing where it's like, how do I, and I think you see that in a lot of the DAO tools, at least that we sort of see kind of get pitched our way, which is like it's taking the current view of things and trying to put a better UX on it or make, but I think if you've been operating these things, you realize, well, like, no, this thing is satisfying okay right now, but it's not the right thing generally, right? So we need to sort of evolve that. Maybe help me understand like how sort of Orca kind of fits. Like, is this an entire platform that is just going to run DAOs? Is this a trustware meets socialware, that an organization that is maybe using various other mechanisms can kind of integrate into what they're doing? Like, what is the shape of this?
Yeah, so we're very specific about what part of the stack that we're helping, which is just managing sort of the permissions and stakeholder graph of your organization. So what that means also, like, I think I'm starting to use the word permissions a little bit more because I think governance has like an ugly connotation with it these days. Like, no one wants to do governance. Governance is broken, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially what governance is like who makes what decisions, which is just permissions. Like, it's just permissions management. That's all that governance is. And I just think the state that we've gotten in with DAOs is like getting into these massive like analysis paralysis type spaces in governance when like it's literally just about permissions management. And so that is what we're building with Orca, is who makes what decisions in your organization, and the ability to more flexibly manage that in your organization through these sort of modular components of pods. So essentially, there's like this thin permissions and governance wrapper around a multi-sig, which allows you to better kind of connect and click these small working groups together to build out like a network of pods. So that is like the one part of the stack that we're working on. I think a lot of other DAO tools have focused more on an action, like we are building the new Trello board, or we're building the Web3 like accounting services, or all of these things, which isn't fundamentally like changing the way people are working or like leveling people further up and getting closer to this like ideal of the DAO. It's really just kind of building like the Web2 equivalent of that and with a Connect wallet. But I think the missing piece right now is like people don't really know how to connect. What information are we absorbing when we connect wallet, when we want to connect you to this Trello board? Like that is sort of the missing piece, is we don't really have this permissions graph in our organizations. I have like a ton of thoughts too, which I know is what Seed Club is extremely opinionated and excited about, is like making sure that we're not being captured by our platforms and building sovereign communities and organizations. And I think that's a big part of what Orca is working towards as well. And I can like go further into that.
I mean, the number of platforms I think expect DAOs to just come and operate on their platform seems just so shocking and off-putting to me. And I think for builders out there who might be listening to this, the reason is because we don't know where this is going, and neither do you. And maybe you do, Julz, but like they don't for sure, right? But you probably don't either. And so like optionality is so much more valuable to us than better tying a few tools together for right now. And I think the tools right now are adequate to go do the things that will allow us to learn what really needs to happen. And obviously there's immense opportunity for improving.
That's what like really scares me right now, is that some of these early tools people are so comfortable just porting over their entire system into because we're so desperate for help. But I think what some people forget is that once you like port over all that information into a certain tool, like that tool then defines your organization and defines your organizational shape. So like if you use, let's say, Google, and like you use Google emails and Google Drive and all these things, like that is inherently capturing your organizational shape by just being the administrator and being able to distribute out emails to different people in his organization. That is where we have like the most unique opportunity in building things on Ethereum, the blockchain, or any blockchain, is like you have this trust layer that we're all opting into, and this trust ledger that we're all agreeing to, and saying that this is our source of truth, not some little data center that Amazon Web Services or Google has. It's saying that it's this sovereign layer that we can all opt into. And so that's what I think is like really important for organizations right now, is that you don't want these tools to be defining your shape, because then you don't have the ability to change your tools and progress and evolve as your organizational needs grow and develop. That's a big part of like our mission with Orca, is that we help you like define your organizational shape so that you can have more sovereignty in the tools that you're using without them capturing your organization. Because if we don't do that, then like we're literally just repeating our Web2 mistakes of like your cool fashion community is now owned by Instagram or whatever like the Web3 equivalent of that is.
I didn't even know that I had a Finsta fashion community. That's super cool. I think we're just noticing that right now. But I think that's like I mean, maybe not to belabor the point, but this is one that I think is just what I see coming through our ventures group and out in the space generally. Is one that I don't think has been internalized by a lot of builders in the space. And I think the majority of innovation in DAO tooling is actually going to be driven by DAOs solving those problems for themselves. And then the place where that isn't the case will be people building tools like yourselves, or like look at what Gnosis is doing or Snapshot is doing or Coordinate is doing, though I guess Coordinate and Gnosis are both good examples of spinouts from other DAOs. So they're building these mechanisms that make it very easy for DAOs that are actually building their own tools to just like embed that mechanism, that structure, I think that does something very, very well into the system in a way that still allows us to have the ownership or sovereignty over the shape of what we're creating rather than, yeah, needing to sort of borrow somebody else's shape.
I think what's interesting too is the ability for individual contributors to pick their own tools as well. Is like when we start to think about DAOs and this like kind of labor network that we're all building, obviously there's kind of this meme of like polyamorous work and that people moving in between DAOs and like the sort of borders of organizations become less clear, I think, in crypto and in DAOs. And I think that's a really unique opportunity is that like no matter what organization you're contributing work to or participating in, your tools can follow you as well without having to like opt into some like gross SAP style tools that like one organization uses. Like you continue to use like your tooling stack that works for you. And I think that's like a really interesting approach as well.
So I think you have to name and shame the DAO that's using SAP because
Thankfully, I don't think anyone yet, but like we
imagine.
might be close.
Sure, yeah, I understand like the draw to it. Okay, so let's stay on this on pods because I think like I wrote this question down, which is like, what the heck are you actually building, right? Which you've answered a big chunk of here already today.
Yeah.
Because I think I'm up in your DMs at least once a quarter, being like, Jules, give me some like, what am I like? Let me. I'm trying to be a thought leader here. I want to get me in on this thing. So I understand. You're like, no, let's just make sure it's right for C Club, and
Yes.
then we'll be able to use it. So I
Yes.
appreciate that. But if we sort of think about like a structure, a traditional structure of DAOs right now, maybe before they sort of step into pods, there's like, let's just say there's token holders. Token holders are acting as maybe board of directors to a degree, but that's pretty generous to say that because there's still like a ton of information
Yeah.
asymmetry there and there's not like a lot of direct responsibility or control, but they're voting on how budgets are being spent. And then in many, there's sort of like other entities underneath that, whether that's individuals or other corporations or other type structures which funds are going to, and work is getting done, or there's sort of this broad permissionless sort of proposals come and people kind of get to vote on whether that capital goes together. And so let's just say there's maybe some version of leadership and direction that's embedded some there. There's some decision making over capital that's going in, and then there's these other entities where work is getting done, hopefully measured and sort of improved on in the future. What does a typical DAO running on that has integrated pods effectively, what is different in that broad structure?
Pods are essentially just creating a different stakeholder class. So you kind of like broke that down beautifully, and like token holders are this weird in between of like board of directors slash just like idle stakeholders. And then we have like core contributors and teams, but we're not really able to create visibility or legibility around those structures that exist. And so pods essentially like enables us to bring those structures like, core teams or essential working groups that have like key functions within the organization to the surface and make those more legible and also more discreetly like delegating power within an ecosystem. And I think like going back to the Brian Armstrong, let's fix Coinbase. We scale too quickly. There's too many people. Like, let's get our shit together. He introduced like a similar concept of pods, and like we need to be breaking out this massive behemoth of an organization into like smaller, more functional working groups. And he's essentially trying to like do what we're doing, but more through socialware. So like an example of what he was doing is like, we need to give more autonomy and basically push power down within the company. This is what Brian was saying. And basically give more autonomy to those individuals within their team. So product directors have full autonomy over their pod and what their product direction is. And that also means that they have more of a sense of ownership over their actions, meaning you got to get revenue positive, you need to meet these milestones, you need to set your own milestones, et cetera, et cetera. But like an example of sort of what he's trying to implement through Socialware that we provide through Trustware is like he wants to give pod leads sort of access to their own P&L statements. So meaning like give them access to their finances so that they can make informed decisions on how they're building out their products or how they're building out their initiatives. And that's essentially kind of the Socialware version of what we're building with pods. Is every pod is like as close to the decision making meat space as possible, meaning that if you're a member of a pod, like you're on this multi-sig, you have access to the tools you need access to, the information you need access to, the funds you need access to, whatever types of powers that are actually distributed in that organization. And I think like that is still really being developed. Like how do we even define power on chain? And I think today it basically exists in like three buckets, which is spending power, governance power, so like token weighted voting, and then contract powers, which is still pretty early in terms of like how we're actually delegating contract parameters or keys to different teams. But that is, I would say, like the three buckets of power that exist on chain. All of those can be used to also validate and I think further support some off-chain powers that exist. If you have a pod that is the marketing pod, you're given a certain budget and also expected to have certain aims and domains that you are driving towards. And the budget that we just gave you validates that those aims and domains are legitimate within this organization.
I think the edges here are really interesting. I guess the way that that can be done right now, absent of Orca, is multiple multi-sigs with more socialware around it, I guess, right? So we're saying, here's these different working groups, and there's an issue with running it from just one multi-sig, and you know, okay, well, maybe I'll just create a group of 7, and we'll do a 4 of 7 on that multi-sig. They'll still have the same sort of socialware. So like, what is it that you're doing that's different there?
And the power that's being delegated to those multi-sigs is entirely captured by the people that sit on those multi-sigs. There's no governable service area around that multi-sig. And that's the inherent problem that Pods is helping fixing, is we're creating this permissions and governance layer around these multi-sigs so that you can better govern them in your organizational permissions. And that it's not just captured by the people that sit on that multi-sig and relying on those human relationships.
And that is actually a very real problem that we're seeing show up in a few, not DAOs that I'm directly involved in, but that I'm hearing about, seeing like these sort of social capture of fairly large funds or amounts of funds. And yeah, you're sort of truly beholden to those people self-selecting to remove themselves, or at least a large enough percentage. So you've taken what could be like a broad, I guess, will token holders sort of have a vote on those permissions? Is that the level of where governance actually happens? Yeah, okay. And instead of relying
that's like the level of modularity that you can create, is delegating and basically breaking up these powers. So you're creating these agent and principal relationships. So you're able to delegate like checks and balances around these groups of people so that it's not captured by, you know, a single entity. And I think, I'm assuming you're talking about Maker when you're referencing, we've seen the capture of a lot of power, ?
I was not, but I think that is a good example. I think there's more subtle ones that will sort of emerge in the next little while, or maybe won't emerge because they will have sort of solved it. Yeah, not my problem. I haven't heard it firsthand, so it's not something I want to share, but I think it's just an indication of like, I mean, you don't have to sort of be a visionary to understand like that if all of a sudden you have a couple $1 million or governed by 7 people, that maybe getting 4 of them to vote to remove themselves from that power could potentially cause some problems in the future. Like, pretty obvious.
But I think Maker is a really good example of where things have headed. Like, I think Maker is one of the more evolved DAOs and like really looked to in the space as a DAO that has some longevity to it. And Maker is in like a very delicate state right now where they feel like there's not a clear vision or strategy or consensus around all of the core units, which is sort of their version of pods in the organization. And oops, we're accidentally spending $50 million a year. And there's no check on the people that are spending that money. Oops, how did that happen? And there's no checks that exist on that expenditure right now. I think it's becoming very clear that these are like essential checks and balances that we need to be importing into our organizations.
Let's poke on that a little bit, because I think like even if we were looking at something like Nouns DAO or Maker, the big gaps seem to be that there isn't that review. How do we make great progress in more traditional organizations? Is like there's very clear objectives that chunk up into bigger visions, and then there's those objectives chunk down into personal OKRs, objectives, KPIs, what those might be. And you're having some very quick review often on a weekly basis around how individuals are making progress towards that. Is there a technological solve there or support there that helps that? Or is that still socialware that needs to be embedded in these teams?
That's a really good question. And I honestly think it is really context dependent, because it's really about what that organization wants to do. How do they want to work? And like, we're not opinionated about the way that you come to those decisions or the way that you're setting up the social structures to meet your objectives. We're just providing the container for you to do it more effectively. I always like to use the example of the US government for this, despite them being also in a very delicate position these days. I think like the 3 branches of government is like the perfect way to think about how we create more like polycentric governance systems, and how we create these different stakeholder groups within DAOs is like, we have citizens that are able to vote and elect different representatives, but they're only able to do that a certain branch of government. then that branch of government has different checks and balances and how they elect the other branches of government, and et cetera, et cetera. It's like we have this like super liquid, fluid system of how we're all keeping each other in check and delegating very clear amounts of power and how those people get that power. And I think that's just like what we're still trying to figure out in DAOs right now. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of these organizations are just looking for a template to adopt. And like the only template that we know is the corporate form. So it's really easy to just be like, decentralization doesn't work. Like, let's just re-centralize this. Let's just do the company form. Because like, that's all we know. And like in this example, these people didn't start a DAO to figure out how to run an organization. They started a DAO to do some other objective, whether it is run a community, build a product, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that a lot of templates are needed, or maybe just more inspiration and experimentation around how we build out those structures would be really healthy, because I think DAOs are in a really delicate place in terms of what that next step is.
I like the example of the US government, but I think like what people will take away from that is that it's a very ineffective, hard to move, very, very expensive sort of governance process. It makes sense
Yeah.
for 300 million plus people, but probably doesn't
Yeah.
for 50 people. Do you see most DAOs starting off with like one pod and it sort of evolves from there? Or
Well, I think that's like an amazing point, is building more, like I think we need to emphasize more evolutionary systems, but like all the mechanisms that we rely on aren't very like evolutionary. Like token weighted voting has not evolved in like however many years since Compound released the initial Governor Bravo. Like it has not evolved whatsoever. So we're not really working within the mindset that these systems are meant to evolve. And that's like a really big part of pods, is like that is exactly what they're designed for, is to build evolutionary structures. You spin up a pod as project needs come up, as team needs come up. You spin down pods as they're no longer relevant or no longer needed. But I think that's also just like a really healthy approach, is just thinking about like a minimum viable structure as well. Do you really need to launch like a Governor Bravo contract and like token weighted voting for your 50 contributors? Like probably not. Like why don't we start with something much smaller and much more realistic in terms of how we're actually going to engage these stakeholders? That's definitely like how we're thinking about pods as well.
yeah, I think it's informative to see how organizations are structuring themselves, especially when they're building products. You are not building Orca as a DAO to start with. Like there's a separate structure that is standing that up. I think even if you look at some other DAOs that are DAOs that are building products, the ones that are making a lot of progress regularly are still operating with these sort of smaller teams. And so, and I think there's like a lot of reasons and challenges for that. Like there's still regulatory uncertainty around it, and all these things lead to like less clear communication on it, and I think slow down adoption quite a bit. But the takeaway, I think, is that if you're building something very complex, which I think even you could look at a DAO as, that it's most likely going to be created by a smaller group of people within this sort of certain philosophy and within this broader sort of ownership structure that still has this sort of decentralized components to it. But that's where progress is being made, and that's where innovation is happening. And introducing that early causes a whole bunch of challenges. And even if let's look at Gitcoin, those guys have done come through a very challenging quarter here, or season, I think they call it, but they're still able to make progress because their work streams are much more defined and clear and have, maybe don't call it hierarchy, but like working agreements within them. Hopefully soon we can sort of disavow this idea of just like completely flat organizations.
Yeah.
And I think there's a number of people even in our world that have experience in building in places where those flat organizations really make sense, often in investing DAOs where the decision is yes, no. And, like everybody has the same stake in the game. But if you're going to go do more complicated things, which I think is like the hard and important work, like not super interested in just building clubs with rich people that can go invest in things like that. I think that's great. I love it. Like that needs to exist. We want to be part of it, but if that's all we go do, like that's not game changing in the way that I think it could be.
I think that's a really good point too. And like different structures are built for different things. And like one of my favorite Vitalik pieces is his piece on vitocracy versus bulldozer governance, which is basically just like two frameworks of governance. So vitocracy, veto-ocracy, basically like stakeholder governance, like what token weighted voting exists today. Bulldozer governance is more like one person and a bulldozer go into town. So giving a high amounts of autonomy to specific individuals or groups. And those are built for two very different things. Like veto-ocracy is built for stability. It's built for more laborious, like time-intensive decisions. So that's why it works really well for like governing Ethereum, the blockchain. We shouldn't be able to make like really quick, give Jess a ton of power to just go make this EIP. We should actually put that under immense amounts of scrutiny because Ethereum blockchain and everyone that's building on top of it is depending on its stability. But why are we applying that same model to like startup DAOs basically that are building products? Like we actually, for what that type of DAO needs, is actually more bulldozer governance, where we're giving like high amounts of autonomy. And that's kind of like what startups are now, is like when, you know, investors invest in like very early teams, that's exactly what they're doing. They're giving them tons of autonomy to just go do whatever they need to do. Pivot, experiment, try things out, build quickly, do what you need to do. I think that that's like a really healthy framework to think of, is like these different types of governance structures meet different needs. And also they can evolve over time. If you start with bulldozer governance, doesn't mean that you can eventually evolve and use like vetocracy-like structures.
One other place where this sort of, I guess, challenge of, let's call it organization design, not governance necessarily, is I think in the creation of silos in really subtle ways where, you know, like I could imagine, we'll use pods and I'll maybe use it more generally than talking about just pods in your context, but you have these pods or working groups that start to identify more with that working group or sort of think about their work in the context of that working group. And so much of the strength, I think, of early stage teams, or this idea of like, what is a great startup team? It's, you know, high agency, intelligent, you know, risk taking individuals that are bringing their creativity and gumption towards solving these things. And you know, the stories of Jeff Bezos packing books in the basement and writing emails, like these are things that are, you know, they're lore right now, but there's also like a lot of truth in that. You're trying to redefine something. You're competing against huge organizations or other entrenched ways of doing things. And it's just a very difficult thing to do. And so you need all hands pulling not only in the same direction, but in like ownership across the entire organization. And one of the things that I've seen is like in subtle ways, it gets diffused where people start to identify with, you know, well, I'm in the product group, or I'm in a community group, or I'm in the governance group, and your locus of identity and focus starts to get chunked in there. And I worry that we don't see the type of collaboration and ownership that's ultimately going to be necessary to move these things from early stage through all the twists and turns to level of success. So I think you used the word, we're building the organizational graph and permission structure. What are your thoughts on maybe what I've just laid out in relation to this idea of an organizational graph? Like, are we just going to entrench those sort of limitations and barriers unnecessarily?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that is like a problem that really we've noticed. And again, to bring up the example of Maker, I think that's something that's happened, is like people just get so siloed in their core units. As context, Maker uses core units, which is just like small groups of team that are delegated specific responsibilities. So one of the problems that I think Maker has dealt with is that core units aren't communicating with each other. And as a result, there's like this lack of vision or strategy or direction that they're having. And I think that's where there's a lot of interesting socialware patterns. Like Hasu, who is a Maker delegate, he recommended like building out a constitution and building out different committees that are responsible for doing exactly that, which is bridging together strategy and applying that to the different core units. But I also love like David Ehrlichman's impact networks, because like I think he specifically gets at this with, he has an example of like a school board and realizing that like when two people left, no one could communicate with each other because they were too relied on as like these little central focal points and nodes within this administration. And I think that's where this like stake and hub map makes a lot of sense, is like you need to basically double link people across these different pods and work streams and departments and all of these things in order to kind of spread context more consistently. But like these are all just like socialware frameworks. Like there's a million ways that you can like slice and dice how you're building context across the organization. And I definitely think it's like an area where we need to do a lot more deep thinking in terms of how we're going to be able to scale these correctly.
Yeah, I think like what's exciting in these types of organizations is that, well, I guess in organizations generally, is that the thinking is probably best done through action. And we have, if you think about where we are today compared to, you know, we started off talking about social tokens back in 2020, like the number of projects that are facing these challenges head on and, you know, in their attempts at solving them, sort of throwing off a lot of the insights that new builders can sort of take on and learn from. And I think it gets to a point that I think is just important for us to try to grok, which maybe is hard to grok before it sort of starts to manifest, which is that we're still talking about DAOs as like this thing. And maybe that's not even the word, right? Because I think very easily you can start to challenge that term, and it's sort of more of a meme now than a really useful term. There's probably going to be
Yeah.
like a lot of these categories that evolve within this context, and the types of structures that we put in place to enable somebody who's building products versus somebody who's building a community versus somebody who's trying to have a social impact DAO are going to look so different. And yet right now we're pulling from the exact same pool of insights and tools and structures.
Yep.
And there's just no way that persists. It's just, we're not going to be successful that way.
Yep. That's exactly why I think that the like last year of like DAO activity was just the beginning of it. I don't think the DAOs have actually had their moment yet. And when they do, it will be like immensely powerful, because I think the sort of problem with what happened in the last year was that people became obsessed with like the structure, kind of what you just identified, which is not the right approach. Like these are going to look in every different like flavor and size that you can imagine for an organization. And there's no like consistent shape that they will take, other than I think relying on similar mechanisms and trustware or infrastructure that they can use to better scale their organization.
So the visual that just came to my mind is like going to an ice cream shop in the 50s was chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. And then the innovation was like
Mm-hmm.
Neapolitan. Exciting, which I love, by the way. But now, like, you go into these gelato places and there's 100 or 1,000 or whatever different
Yes.
flavors, and very imperfect analogy, but I think it sort of shows the evolution of taste.
I think people forget that like a lot of the experimentation and like question marks we have right now is the work. That is exactly what we're working towards, is like to be in this phase of experimentation and implementing new ideas. Like a lot of them will not work. And like we're essentially fighting against and unlearning what we've been told our whole lives, which is like this corporate form. And like all of our tools are built to ingest the corporate form. All of our systems and institutions are built to ingest the corporate form. This is just a completely new way in thinking about how we're building out organizations and institutions. And so naturally, there's going to be a lot of friction when we actually get to building those. And I think just people need to remember like and have a sense of patience when we are working through a lot of these challenges, because like that is the most important work.
And you don't have to go too far back in history to see that evolution happen, right? Like the corporation is a relatively new in the course of human history, like innovation, and even seeing the flurry of innovations happen over the last 20 years as sort of startups have evolved and et cetera. So I think it's very difficult to totally grok the size and scale of Web3, of crypto, of even the sort of like the various outputs or structures that are going to exist in the DAO space itself. And very hard to see in advance.
Yeah, an example I love using is this podcast I listen to on productivity in the United States. And basically, over the last like 100 plus years, productivity has just been on like this crazy upward trajectory. Like every year, we just become like more and more productive as like a labor group. And those are for obvious things. Like we have industrial revolution, we have telecommunications, we have computers, we have the internet, blah, blah, blah. What's really interesting is that in the last like 10 to 20 years, productivity in the United States has completely plateaued. It's interesting because like in the last 10 to 20 years, we are at an all-time high in terms of peak technological innovation. The tech industry and software industry is out of control in the last 10 to 20 years, yet we've completely plateaued as like a productivity machine. And I think that's like a really interesting thing to ground some of our like future DAO aspirations, is that basically what, I mean, this is my theory, is like in the last 10 to 20 years, we've been more focused on measuring our productivity and measuring our work rather than actually building systems that will increase our productivity or our efficiency or capability for more productive, exciting work. And I think that's where we have like a really interesting opportunity with DAOs.
I don't think we have the right structures legally or philosophically to capture the value that's being created in these networks efficiently. And I think if you've
Yeah.
gone through like the Industrial Revolution, what that was, or let's just say even sort of like the Taylorization in sort of factory work, led to like a lot of that value going to, the labor being able to capture a lot more of the value that's being created in these sort of corporate mechanisms. And, now we
Mm.
are building these networks that are being worth, in some cases, trillions of dollars. And yet the labor in those networks is not capturing any of that value, or a very small slice of it. And it's sort of like the equity holders in these organizations are. And so I'm sure there's like many reasons. There's also been this sort of that decoupling of sort of productivity and wage growth in the United States goes back into the 70s. And it's a big question mark for a lot of economists. But I think there's something in here in that like our world has shifted from the firm being the main value creator and organizer to firms that own networks. I think the natural evolution of it is to networks being like the coordinator. And, to me, this is why I invest my heartbeats into C Club, into the Web3 space generally, is because, the ability to have ownership and capture some of the value that you're creating on these networks just doesn't exist in our existing structures, or it's very frictionful in doing that. And so my hope is we can solve some of these problems. I think DAOs are the governance and the organizational mechanism that ultimately allows us to operate those things effectively. And, figuring this out, I think, is essential to the social stability of the societies that we live in. And so maybe that sounds a little grand, et cetera. But I think when I come back to like both conviction I have in the space and also like the why it's here, it's that. I saw early on what social media was doing to different businesses and to publications. And you can just see how that could cascade up to so many different networks as this is happening, segments of the economy as networks start to take over. And you go, okay, well, this is like probably not a good thing on the path that we're on, and we need something different. Thank goodness for human ingenuity that we start to come up with things like blockchains, and people are investing their heartbeats in this sort of stuff. I've absolutely loved this conversation. I'm curious, I want to give you space just to like point people in the right direction for where they can kind of get more involved and see what you're building. Also, like when beta for me, I'm just going to say that again. But maybe more interesting to sort of leave the conversation off is like, I know you were sort of like deeply building this stuff, but also you're out there updating your mental models of the world so that you can be an effective chief pod officer. What are some interesting experiments that you see happening in a space that maybe we can point people to?
Yes. Okay, so definitely check us out on Twitter, of course, Orca Protocol. And as some alpha, are you ready for this, Jess? Public beta this summer. So definitely be on the lookout for that. In terms of interesting experiments that are being run, it's a great question.
Maybe not just experiments themselves, but like what are some communities or teams or places that we should be just keeping a closer eye on, just because they are likely to be a source of experiments. Obviously, you're going to put C Club out there. Obviously, you have to do it. I'm also going to
Obviously,
throw Gitcoin out there. So
yeah,
talk about them often
I
as
was I
well.
was just going to say that. I think I'm most excited about the communities that have a much more outward facing goal and vision for their networks, like Seed Club and Gitcoin. Like Seed Club is on a mission to empower communities at large. Gitcoin is on a mission to help enhance public goods at large. And like I think as a result, that's where some of the most interesting and innovative things are happening, because there's such an outward approach of like what we're trying to build, and it's not so, I guess, focused on the internal. I think that's where there's so much good stuff that's happening.
Awesome. Well, we can leave it there. Thank you for spending an hour with us here today as part of our exploration on decision making and governance, and like kind of like the meat and potatoes of operating these things. Definitely has given me a better understanding of what you're building and where this fits. And I think there's some really great insights in this conversation for operators and also for folks that are really eager to go build useful things for these communities. I think it's just, I sent a tweet a while back that was like, we need more DAOs, not more DAO tools, which, well, who knew there were so many people building DAO tools out there that took offense to that? But I
I
truly
know.
believe we need more DAO tools as well. I just want them to be driven by insights from the people that are actually building here. And it sounds like that's very much the path you're on. So very excited to see that public beta, get our hands on it, see how we can embed that into what we're doing at C Club. And, we have our 5th cohort that's kicking off in September. So being able to like empower them with a whole bunch of new tools would be a wonderful thing to do, I think.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for having me, Jess. It's always a pleasure. Appreciate you.